Well, let us turn in our Bibles to Paul's first letter to the Corinthians and chapter 8. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians and chapter 8. The first century city of Corinth was renowned for several things, and amongst them were immorality and idolatry. And that is why in their letter to the Apostle Paul, don't forget chapter 7 verse 1 indicates that Paul is now responding to things that they have asked him about in a previous letter. And in their letter to the Apostle Paul, the Corinthian Christians raised both of those issues. At the start of chapter 7, you may remember, they brought up the issue of sexual immorality, and their suggestion on that subject was that in view of how much immorality there was all around them, it was better to avoid sexual relationships, full stop. And it was in response to that suggestion, you may remember, that Paul wrote on the subject of marriage, and he emphasized that the rightful place of sexual relationships was within the marriage relationship. But now that we've reached the start of chapter 8, we discover that the next issue they raised in their letter to him, or at least the next issue that Paul chose to respond to, was the issue of idolatry. And in particular, the eating of food which had been previously sacrificed to idols. That was a big issue for these first century Christians, these young Christians, because first century Corinth would have had its fair share of temples and shrines. The temple of Apollos and Hermes being amongst them. And in addition to those places being centres of religious activity, they would also have been centres of social activity. For example, wedding receptions, birthday parties, and much of the hospitality industry would have often occurred at places of religious significance. And consequently, it was difficult to live in Corinth and completely isolate yourself from the idolatry of that place. There was even a good chance that the meat sold in the marketplace had been associated with a temple or a shrine or a religious guru at some stage in its history. That's how much idolatry pervaded first century Corinthian society. And so it's not surprising to find these relatively young Christians looking to Paul for his advice on such matters. And it's here in chapters 8 to 10 of his letter to them that he seeks to answer them. And the first thing we hear him saying as he does so is in verses 1 to 3, and there we learn that love is more important than knowledge. Love is more important than knowledge. Now, although Paul raises the subject of food which has been offered to idols in chapter 8, verse 1, it is not until verse 4 that he will address that particular subject in detail. What he does, you may have noticed, first of all, in the opening 3 verses, is he takes a step back, as it were, and he discusses what is in some way a far bigger subject. And that is the subject of knowledge and love, and how they relate to the Christian's freedom and the Christian's conscience. He addresses that first, because in Corinth, and in every church since then, what you will find is that Christians have a difference of opinion on some things, and Christians come to different conclusions on certain things, and especially so on those things relating to our conscience, i.e., what we can and cannot do as Christian people. Please note, the issue in 1 Corinthians 8 is not just matters of difference of personal opinion. It's not just matters of difference of personal preference. It's about differences on matters of conscience. What I do and cannot do as a Christian. What I do and should feel guilty about. what I cannot do and feel okay about. It's matters of conscience. And that is not a new phenomenon. It was clearly the case in New Testament times, and it appears to have been the case within the church here in Corinth. On the subject of food sacrificed to idols, it appears that there was a difference of opinion within the church as to what a Christian should and should not do. And before giving his verdict on the matter itself, Paul takes this step back, as it were, and he considers the bigger issue of how we should respond on matters of conscience over which we disagree. And as he does so, he begins in verse 1 by quoting what was probably one of the Corinthian slogans or catchphrases, and that was, "We all possess knowledge." We all possess knowledge. Do you realize as a Christian, you possess knowledge? Having become Christians, our understanding of many things has changed considerably. Whereas we may have previously believed in no God or in a plurality of gods, we now believe in the one true, living and eternal God, as we've just sung about. Our eternal worldview has changed enormously in that we now see the world as being created by a sovereign God who continues to rule over the world in his sovereign power. Our moral framework has changed in that we now acknowledge this one true creator God to be the rightful moral lawgiver who alone has the authority to tell us as creatures what is true and what is false, what is right and what is wrong. Our understanding and knowledge of how we can be in a right relationship to God has changed radically on becoming a Christian. We're no longer burdened by the continual need to think that we have to merit brownie points with God. But instead we rejoice that our acceptance with God is on the basis of grace alone, through faith alone, in Jesus Christ alone. Those are some of the great truths that we now know as a result of becoming a Christian, and the longer we are Christians, the more we ought to understand them and appreciate them. As some of the Christians in Corinth were saying in verse 1, having become Christians, we all possess such great knowledge. And although Paul does not deny what they're saying, he does want to add a word of caution. And that is verse 1. Knowledge puffs up. Knowledge puffs up. Apparently that little phrase, puffs up, it only appears 5 times in the whole of the New Testament, and 4 of them are in this letter to Corinth, which tells you something. Knowledge puffs up. With the acquisition of knowledge comes the very real risk of becoming proud and arrogant, the result being that we look down on those who don't quite have as much knowledge as we do. That is the danger that knowledge brings. But, says Paul, in contrast to knowledge which puffs up, love builds up. The other problem with knowledge is verse 2. The man who thinks he knows something does not yet know as he ought to know. No matter how much we know, or no matter how much we think we know, our knowledge will still be partial. And that there'll be so much more that we still don't know. Did you realize that? It's true of every area of life. You leave university thinking you know everything there is to know on your subject. After all, you've studied it for 3 years. What else can there possibly be to know? Well, if that is you, then sorry to disappoint you. But on leaving university, you discover that you've just been scratching the surface of your subject for the past 3 years. And if that is true of our experience in the sciences and the arts and the humanities and all the rest of it, then how much more is it true when it comes to biblical truth? Have you ever noticed that the more you read and study the Bible, the more you realize just how little of it you really know and understand? And therefore, in view of the fact that our knowledge and our understanding at best is going to be partial and limited and even faulty in some respects, it is best not to allow our actions in matters of conscience to be governed on the basis of such partial and possibly even flawed knowledge alone. Now, that is not to say that knowledge plays no part in our decision making. Of course it does. Knowledge plays an enormous part as to what we should and should not do. That is why we look to the Scriptures for our direction on such matters and our decision-making on such matters. It is there that God has revealed what we should and should not do, and so we seek to know and understand what God has revealed in such matters. But in addition to having knowledge on making such decisions, we need to have love as well. Because, verse 3, the man who loves God is known by God. The Bible makes it clear that the only reason we love God is because he has firstly taken the initiative to love us, and out of love for us has brought us into relationship with himself through the person and work of his Son, Jesus Christ. And the ultimate test as to whether we've been loved by God and brought into relationship with God, the ultimate test is whether we love him. Please note, the ultimate test is not how much we know intellectually about God, but whether we love God. And as Jesus made clear to his disciples, and as John makes clear in his first letter, a genuine love for God will of necessity manifest itself in visible, tangible ways, such as our obedience to God, our love for God's people, and our willing acceptance of the truth which God has revealed about his Son, Jesus Christ. Those are the ways in which a true and genuine love for God manifests itself in our lives, and the fact that our beliefs are part and parcel of it indicates, just in case I misunderstood this morning, it indicates that true biblical Christianity is not mindless or anti-intellectual. Paul is not against knowledge per se, after all. It's from his great epistles that we get a vast amount of our knowledge. Becoming a Christian includes an understanding and a knowledge and the belief of the truth that God has revealed. But as someone has rightly said, true, and having become a Christian, by the way, our ultimate goal in life is to become more like Christ. And as someone has rightly said, true Christ-likeness is ultimately seen in love. The full heart and not the full head. And if this person says, if a head full of knowledge is not governed by a heart full of love, all you have is a swollen head. Because as Paul says here in verse 1, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And so however necessary and however important knowledge may be, love is the greater and more important Christian virtue. And especially so within the context of determining what we should and should not do as Christian people. And just in case you're not sure how that can be the case, that leads me to my second point, verses 4 to 8. And there we see the need for love in our actions. The need for love in our actions. Now, having emphasised the importance of love, Paul now returns in verse 4 to the issue which prompted this chapter in the first place, and that was food which had been sacrificed to idols. And what Paul does in verses 4 to 8 is address some of the theological concepts which this issue involves. Now, whether or not this was the argument that some were using within the Corinthian church to justify their eating of such food is difficult to say, but regardless of what others might or might not be saying, this is what Paul is saying, verse 4. We know that an idol is nothing at all in the world, and that there is no God but one. And so, like the Old Testament prophets hundreds of years before him, I read from Isaiah, but there's many others. Like the Old Testament prophets hundreds of years previously, Paul is adamant that there is only one God. Oh, as Paul goes on to say in verse 5, there are many so-called gods and so-called lords, things that people bow down to, things that people give their allegiance to, things that people sacrifice to. The first century world had its fair share of them. And our 21st century world has no less of them. In fact, probably a lot more of them. Do you realize that? Hinduism alone recognizes somewhere in the region of 33 million deities. And so, as Paul says, there are plenty of so-called gods and so-called lords around, plenty of them. And you see them in every society. In our materialistic West, you might think, well, I don't see many of them around. Don't you believe it? They just take a different shape and a different form. They're everywhere. Yet for us, Christian people, verse 6, there is but one God, from whom all things came and for whom we live. And there is but one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things came and through whom we live. Please note, the one thing that distinguishes the one true God from all the so-called gods of this world is that he is the Creator. The Creator from whom and for whom everything owes its existence. He is the Creator. And so that being the case, and this is the thing, as we discovered in that little reading from Isaiah 40, this is the thing about man-made gods. Don't forget, they are created gods. He's the Creator. Their little idols are created things. And the contrast, the created man-made idols of this world, says Paul, they amount to nothing. Nothing. As the Old Testament prophets pointed out centuries earlier, they're dead, they're dumb, they're lifeless statues. They are the consequence of man's sinful and rebellious imagination. They are nothing more than the product of his metalworking and woodworking skills. And therefore they're of no real significance whatsoever. Regardless of how much significance people attach to them, the so-called gods of this world amount to nothing in reality. Nothing. Pieces of wood, pieces of metal, figments of man's imagination. And what is more, says Paul in verse 8, what is more, the food that we eat, that's of no spiritual significance whatsoever. As Paul says, food does not bring us nearer to God. We are no worse if we do not eat and no better if we do. And therefore it makes no difference whatsoever to our spiritual lives if we eat fish on a Friday or chocolate during Lent. Makes no difference whatsoever. Not a hoot of difference. As Jesus said on one occasion, Mark chapter 7, it is not what goes into a man that makes him unclean. It's what comes out of a man. And having emphasized that an idol amounts to nothing, and having emphasized that food is of no spiritual significance whatsoever, the point that Paul is clearly making within this context is that it makes no difference to our spiritual life if we eat food which has previously been sacrificed to an idol. It makes no difference to our spiritual life. And that is why Paul refers in verse 9, if you just want to cast your eyes ahead to verse 9, that is why he refers to your freedom as a Christian in regards to this matter. He wouldn't refer to our freedom in this chapter if he didn't think that we were free too. But what Paul wants to emphasize in this passage is that although our knowledge of those truths that he's just explained, Although our knowledge of those truths means that we may eat food previously sacrificed to an idol, that does not always mean that we should eat food sacrificed to an idol. And here's why not. Verse 7. But not everyone knows this. Or as the ESV says, not all possess this knowledge. You see, it is one thing to nod our head or to tick the box beside those theological statements in verses 4 and 8. And as you heard Paul explain them, the idol is absolutely nothing and the food is of no significance whatsoever. It's very easy for us to nod our head and tick the box and say, oh yes, we wholeheartedly agree with that, Paul. But it's another thing. It's another thing for those truths to change our conscience. When our conscience has been moulded and shaped for years in a certain way. And that is why Paul goes on in verse 7 to speak about people, please note Christian people, who are still so accustomed to thinking of idols in the traditional sense that when they eat such food they think of it as having been sacrificed to an idol, and since their conscience is weak, it is defiled. Now that is the problem. That is the problem in making decisions about such matters on the basis of knowledge alone, even if that knowledge is true biblical knowledge. The problem with making decisions on the basis of your knowledge only, even if that knowledge is biblically and theologically correct, is that it only takes into account your conscience and not the consciences of those around you. Although you may be able to justify a particular course of action biblically and theologically, and therefore have a clear conscience about doing it, there may be other Christians around you who haven't quite understood the issue as clearly and as biblically as you have, and consequently they cannot justify it, and therefore they wouldn't have a clear conscience about doing it. And the reason why Paul took 3 verses at the start of the chapter to emphasize that love was the greater Christian virtue and of more importance than knowledge is because in situations like that, you ought to be doing the loving thing, not just the knowing thing. You ought to be doing the loving thing and take your fellow Christian's conscience into account. That is the need for love in our decision making as to what we should and should not do as Christian people. And it's a need that crops up in every culture and in every generation of church history. Now, I appreciate that some of you come from countries and cultures where the subject of food sacrificed to idols might be very relevant. Still a big issue in vast areas of our world today. For us living in this society, the issue may seem a little bit remote, a little bit removed from everyday life. But that does not mean that this passage is of no relevance. For the simple reason that there are always things which some Christians can do with a clear conscience, while others would have a guilty conscience about doing those very same things. Did you realise that? It may be, for example, and I'll mention a few. You can probably think of plenty of others, and if you've got some others, bring them along on Tuesday night. But I'll mention a few. It may be, for example, the thought of going to the pub and having a pint. And the fact that half of you have gasped and half of you haven't shows that it's a relevant illustration. It may be those things we feel comfortable or don't feel comfortable about doing on a Sunday. It may be, to come a little bit closer to the context of 1 Corinthians 8, It may be the thought of buying and eating halal meat. But whatever the issue is, the principle of 1 Corinthians 8 is that it's not enough. It's not enough to biblically and theologically satisfy your own conscience on the matter. You also have to consider the consciences of the fellow Christians around you. To say that my knowledge or my understanding of the Bible allows me to do such and such a thing, and therefore I'm going to do it regardless of what other people might think, that is a rather selfish use of your Christian freedom and your Christian liberty. That is the attitude that some within the Corinthian church appear to have been demonstrating on the basis of their knowledge. And that is why Paul has to remind them in verse 1 that knowledge puffs up, whereas love builds up. And so the question we need to ask on matters of conscience is not just, what does my biblical and theological understanding allow me to do? But also, and more importantly, what is the loving thing to do? What is the loving thing to do towards my brother and sister in Christ, for whom my actions may cause offence? And should they follow me and do those things, it may very well defile their conscience. That is the need for love in our actions. Thirdly and finally, verses 9 to 13. The danger of acting on the basis of knowledge alone. The danger of acting on the basis of knowledge alone. Now, having introduced the possibility of a brother or sister with a weaker conscience in verse 7, Paul tells us in verse 9 that we need to be careful that the exercise of our freedom, please note he says that within the context of this chapter, which suggests that strictly speaking he thinks there is an area and aspect of Christian freedom, but he says be careful that the exercise of your freedom does not become a stumbling block to the weak. And if you're a little bit puzzled how your actions on such matters could possibly be a stumbling block to another Christian, then just listen to the vivid example that Paul gives, verse 10. For if anyone with a weak conscience sees you who have this knowledge eating in an idol's temple, won't he be emboldened to eat what has been sacrificed to idols? Now don't forget, this is Corinth. And therefore some within the congregation would have been converted, and probably converted quite recently, out of a pagan idolatrous background. And it may be that a young believer who hasn't quite thought through the theological implications about idols and food, as explained by Paul in verses 4 and 8, it may be that a young believer, he sees you entering and eating in a pagan temple. Because you sound so knowledgeable, and because you're so confident in your knowledge, this young believer looks up to you as a mature Christian. And on seeing you do that, he thinks to himself, that's interesting. That's interesting. I wouldn't have dreamt of doing that now that I'm a Christian. But if he or she does it, then it must be okay, and therefore I'm going to do it anyway. But you see, what might be okay for you to do in principle may not be okay for them to do for the simple reason that they have a weak conscience, and to do that thing would mean them going against their conscience, and therefore it would mean them sinning against their conscience. As Paul says in verse 11, so this weak brother for whom Christ died is destroyed by your knowledge. And therefore, verse 12, when you sin against your brother in this way and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Do you see how serious this whole matter of conscience and Christian freedom can be? And to make matters worse, that return to the temple in Corinth, it may prove too much of a temptation for that weaker Christian. And that may turn out to be the first in a series of steps which sees him return to the pagan idolatry which he had previously been delivered from. Do you see how dangerous it can be if we act on the basis of knowledge alone? It's so serious that Paul goes as far to say in verse 13, therefore, if what I eat causes my brother to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause him to fall. Now, there was no one understood Christian liberty more than the Apostle Paul. And there was no one who appreciated his Christian freedom more than the Apostle Paul. If you have any doubts about that, then you read Romans chapter 14 and 15 and you'll see that. And yet, for the sake of his fellow Christian, and out of love for his fellow Christian, he's willing to rein in his freedom. He is willing to curb his liberty. He's prepared not to do certain things, which he knows as a Christian, he is in principle perfectly free to do. He's willing to restrain the exercise of his freedom because he knows the danger of acting on the basis of knowledge alone. And that is quite a challenge for us here in this Western society. And I say that because our culture is very individualistic. And it encourages us to think about what is good for me and for me alone. The mantra of our society is that I'll do what I think is right. I'll do what suits me. I'll do what benefits me. I'll do what makes me happy. It's all about me, 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 me. Whereas 1 Corinthians 8 is challenging in that it teaches that it's not all about me. Did you realize that? As a Christian, there are other people to consider. And those are your brothers and sisters in Christ. And I ought to take them into account when I'm deciding what I will and will not do. Oh, please note, not just for the sake of keeping them happy. 1 Corinthians 8 is not about keeping people happy. It is much more serious than that. It's about taking the necessary steps so that I don't offend or defile a fellow believer's conscience, verse 7. It's about taking the necessary steps so that I don't become a stumbling block to a fellow believer, verse 9. It's about taking the necessary steps so that I don't wound a fellow believer's conscience and in doing so sin against them and more importantly sin against Christ, verse 12. It's about taking the necessary steps so that I don't destroy a brother or sister for whom Christ died. Verse 11. And just to go back to some of my previous illustrations, for us here in our society, taking those necessary steps It may mean refraining from the consumption of alcohol if I'm in certain people's company, even if I know that I am free to drink it. Those necessary steps may mean that I don't talk about certain films in certain people's company, even if my conscience is clear in watching those films. Those necessary steps may mean that I don't purchase or eat halal meat in the presence of certain people, even if I am persuaded that I'm free to do so. Those necessary steps may mean that I don't rave on about how good my national rugby team played last Sunday afternoon if I'm in the presence of people who would struggle with the idea of watching sport on a Sunday, even if my conscience is clear in having done so. Those are just some of the ways in which we ought to be willing to curb and restrain our liberty for the sake of fellow believers who, on a particular issue, may have a weak conscience. To ignore our fellow believers in the pursuit of our own personal freedom is not only inconsiderate, but as we hear Paul explain in verses 9 to 13, it can be dangerous, in that it can so easily become a stumbling block for them. That is the danger of acting on knowledge alone. 3 lessons from 1 Corinthians 8. Firstly, love is more important than knowledge. Secondly, the need for love in our actions. Thirdly, the danger of acting on the basis of knowledge alone.